Hey y'all, welcome to the Movement Multiverse Podcast. My name is Max and I will be your host. The Movement Multiverse Podcast is the show that talks movement way beyond muscles and mechanics, but sometimes doesn't. I'll talk about how movement shows up in our bodies, screens, cities, stories, emotions, and more. If you're a movement nerd like me or are just diving into the topic, this is your universe. So like I said, my name's Max. I will be your host. I'm a physical therapy student. I have my undergraduate degree in kinesiology, personal training. I did for a few years during undergrad. So a little bit of experience with movement. And today's actually our first official episode, which is pretty exciting. So to start us off, I wanted to bring in a quote that I think can take us through this episode. And that is, movement is an expression of the soul. Without it, humans are only muscle, bone, and tissue. When you hear the word soul, I think we kind of go to the idea of divinity. And when we think divinity, we think origin or where we came from. So that's kind of where this episode is headed. That's why it's titled, In the Beginning, There Was Movement. Because guess what? In the beginning, humans have been moving since we were created. And this episode isn't going to really focus on how we developed our movement or how we still move today. It's a little different in how it's going to portray that idea. I'm going to come from more of a historical perspective, and I'm going to share with you a certain time period that I think is most relatable. It can definitely attribute some attributes of that time period to now. And then I'll talk about how that influences some of our modern perspectives of movement, things like health and fitness, freedom, politics, power, ego. And then why, I'll try to answer the questions, why do we think this way about movement? And was it human nature or was it more nurture? So things like history, cultures, etc. All right, so let's get into it. In the beginning, there was movement. So a certain time period that I think plays a huge role in how we perceive movement today was from the Italian Renaissance, and that was about around the time of the 15th to 17th century, so 1400s to 1600s. So if we're looking back, that was about 500, maybe 600 years ago. So quite a long time ago that these events and people were taking place. But I think it's pretty interesting to bring into how we think about movement today. I actually went to Italy back in 2019. So in 2019, I went to Italy. I visited Florence, Rome, Milan, a couple other cities. And the purpose of the trip was actually to discuss how anatomy through art influences either our medical practices or the way we think about the body. So a couple of people that I think are worth bringing up are Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. Those are two names you probably heard, Ninja Turtles, right? But also they were pretty big influences during that 15th to 17th century. So keep the names in mind, or those names in mind, before we move on. So we mentioned movement a lot. It's in the title of the podcast. It's in the title of the episode. So let's get a quick definition of what that really means. So if you do a quick search on Google, you'll find that Merriam-Webster defines movement as just the act or process of moving. So the body's moving, that's movement. But they also define movement as a subset. There's a subset definition through motion. So motion is the act of representing or suggesting movement. So movement versus motion, we can think movement is more dynamic. Motion is more static movement. But both suggest something dynamic is happening, right? So we're going to go into that a little bit further. I just mentioned Michelangelo and Leo da Vinci, both artists and sculptors. When we think art, it's more static, right? So Michelangelo, I'm going to touch on first. He described himself more as a sculptor. He definitely made a ton of sculptures. If you visit Florence, you'll see tons of them posted outside of City Hall in the center of the town. You'll see a lot of his paintings displayed throughout the museums. One in particular that he made is called the David. By the way, this is the same guy that made the Sistine Chapel painting. So this guy definitely knows what he's doing. So he also made the David. It was a sculpture that really represented power, stature, freedom. And just to give some context, the Florentine Republic had just gained or was trying to gain independence from the outside forces like Medici's or other city-states around Italy. So this stature had to be a way of portraying that the Florentine Republic could stand on its own. So Michelangelo chose the David, and this is a biblical story where David beat Goliath in a battle, David being a much smaller figure, Goliath being a much bigger one. Michelangelo used a variety of methods to show that David was this strong figure. And this was actually going to be displayed at the government city hall. So it had to be great. So to be great, he chose marble as the stone of choice. So if we think marble may be more wealthy or higher status, and within that marble, he carved David, which has a lot of really cool muscular anatomy, pretty accurate in its reflection of a human's anatomy. Just for comparison, a lot of sculptures that he made really exaggerated the musculature on purpose to show different qualities. But David was much more realistic in its perception. So what's interesting about the David is we just mentioned motion versus movement. David was that idea of motion, more static, but really showed that motion could happen and that he could stand on his own. So how did he do that? One way he did that was through a pose called contrapposto. So if you imagine you have your hand on your hip while you're standing, you kind of rest on that same hip. So you're kind of chillaxed but still in control. That's how he made this sculpture, and through the musculature lines and the way he sculpted, not super chiseled physique, but just enough to show that it doesn't take much to have power, but through having some musculature and portraying that this guy was athletic, he could beat someone else in battle. It's super interesting to think about how that could relate to modern practice. So keep the David in mind as we keep our conversation going. The other guy during this period was Leo da Vinci. So maybe a more familiar name. He actually never described himself as an artist, or would rarely describe himself as an artist. He was more describing himself as an inventor, engineer, mathematician, scientist. But one of his most famous pieces was the Vitruvian Man. So I'm sure you've seen this. It's the circle, and it has the figure in the middle where the guy has his feet about shoulder width apart, and then his arms kind of look like wings. So if you look on the back of some euros, you'll find the Vitruvian Man is on it. And what's different about this is he's coming more from the perspective that divinity was perfect. The creation of human is perfect. That's why it's the circle. There's no corners. There's no weird lines. It's a perfect circle. The man fits perfectly within it. And God's creation is perfect in that the human is perfect. So what does that mean in terms of movement? It's more of a descriptor of humans as a whole. It's not really suggesting motion like the David does for Michelangelo. There's not really any specific pose, so it's hard to infer what the Vitruvian Man is doing. So now you have two examples. You have the David, you have the Vitruvian Man to compare from this time period, and maybe you've already started to think about how those perceptions of humans or the ideal physique and the way we display that influences our thoughts about either movement or musculature, health and fitness, etc. What's also interesting about those two is Michelangelo more so used sculptures as a means of power. So I'll draw on a couple of modern examples that show how both static and dynamic motion or movement can influence people's thoughts about power. So let's talk about Michael Jackson. Maybe not someone you would think of immediately as a modern day example of really using movement to influence things like control over a crowd or perception of himself. But one really interesting example is from the 1993 Super Bowl. So if you haven't seen it, I would watch it on YouTube if you can. But it's a 13-minute long show, just like pretty much every other Super Bowl show. But what makes it stand out is the first 2 minutes, he doesn't move. He pops out from the stage and he just stands there for 2 whole minutes. So 2 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, but in this, it really was. And why it's important is he's using that same idea that Michelangelo used in terms of posing to display power, to display control, to display composure, all these other things without even moving a muscle, without saying a word. So in terms of modern examples, we think of things like social media or Instagram, all of our fitness influencers. How does their posing influence our thoughts about them, or thoughts about them, thoughts about ourselves, thoughts about society's beliefs about health and fitness as a whole? But going back to Michael Jackson, he used that to display his control, his composure as a performer. And of course, he has all the dynamic moves, right, that everyone knows about. But just a modern example of how movement matters in the way we perceive other parts of the world. Another maybe more long-standing example is something called the royal wave. So I actually found out about this a couple of years ago when I watched The Crown on Netflix. If you haven't watched it, it's a pretty good show. But it's really about how supreme power is super delicate. If you know anything about the British royalty, the hold on government through both the Parliament and the royal palace is super delicate. And one thing I thought was super weird, I noticed really early on, was the wave that they did when they would go out on the balcony or they'd go through a parade. So if you notice the wave, it's just a little tweak from a normal wave. They'll have all their fingers together, slightly bent, and then all they'll do is rotate their forearm. The hand really won't do much movement. But it's just a super small, dynamic movement that changes the way we think about people who might not be so different from us, but it makes us perceive them differently. So again, let's draw on a modern example of this, or something that's more relatable. All right, so now we've talked about Michael Jackson, we've talked about The Crown, the royal wave, we've talked about Michelangelo's work, the David, we've talked about Leo da Vinci and his perception of idealism or optimalism of the human physique and human body. So we have all these different perspectives of movement. So let's try and put it together into some modern, maybe more relatable examples. So let's talk about self-perception and the confidence that's related to movement. So imagine you're walking into an interview and the first movement you do is you shake the other person's hands and you look directly in their eyes. Compare that to the same interview. Say you walk in, eyes are down on the floor, very timid, soft handshake. It immediately changes the influence or idea the other person has of you just based on 2 simple movements without you saying a word. There's also the idea of physique. Now we have someone else walk in who is more muscular in build. They shake the hand nice and firm. They look them in the eyes. Maybe that interviewer is now thinking or making assumptions about discipline, how that person values their time, what sort of things they look for in a company, or what sort of things they look for in a leader. So again, we haven't said a word yet in this interview, and just based on simple movements or motion suggesting movement, either the interviewer or the interviewee has already made assumptions about us. So movement does matter. We could also talk about the idea of discipline. We kind of just touched on it in the interview, but people who tend to have physiques that reflect discipline, like going to the gym, are often perceived as more intelligent. Maybe they're perceived as having more discipline. They are more willing to do things outside of work, for example. And then there's also motivation. They see that the person may have been working out for a really long time, exercising, moving for a long time. They know this person can carry motivation, no matter its fluxes, and achieve a goal. So then it reflects on values, right? If we can achieve a goal over a long period of time by showing that through our movement or physique, we have created a self-perception of ourselves that other people also perceive. And that draws on our history, right? We might not know it, but those ideal images of ourselves draw hundreds of years ago on their philosophy of movement and ideal human physiques. Here's another example. Social media, huge right now, especially for health and fitness. I think the industry for health and fitness and social media is booming, and I think that's great, but it also is not so great. So when we're talking about comparing, if you're making comparison to yourself versus somebody else, why are you making that comparison? Why does them having a six-pack ab versus you not having it matter to you? Is it that idea of idealism or optimal human strength, looks, the idea that the person can move maybe better than you, that is influencing your thoughts of yourself? And then it even affects our expectations of ourselves, right? Or the expectations of somebody else's thoughts of us. So these are just things that you can reflect on through movement as you go through your daily life that I'm trying to help you understand so that you can become more movement literate and make more intentional either movements or decisions so you can either better yourself or, maybe just observe. So what can movement do? We've kind of brought it all together, right? It's the belief in our ability to do hard things. Maybe it's our own belief or somebody else's belief. We're influencing the minds of others, of ourselves. And maybe it'll change the way you think about yourself as you notice how movement influences us in so many different ways, whether it be through politics, through social media, through power, through freedom to do our hobbies. So movement isn't only a tool for health and fitness, it's a way to tell stories and express your freedom. So movement does matter. Movement is for everyone. So with that, it kind of brings us to the end of this episode. A little bit of a shorter one, but I really appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed this content or you're interested in hearing more, go ahead and give us a follow. Comment any suggestions or debates you want to start in the comments about the content that was shared, maybe a reflection that you had, and then share this podcast with anyone or any movement nerd that you know might like this podcast. So in the next episode, we're going to be talking about what Ted Lasso teaches us about moving with back pain. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.